What if I told you that Oscar Piastri's accident in Brazil was not the driver's fault, but the consequence of a technical secret that McLaren had known about since racing and never solved? It all started with what appeared to be a simple driving error in wet conditions. A common scene in Formula One: wet track, reduced visibility, treacherous curbs, and a young driver facing the challenge of a critical lap in the Interlagos sprint. But behind Oscar Piastri's accident at Brazil 2025 there was a much deeper story, one that could not be explained solely from the visual or from superficial telemetry. What happened that morning in Sao Paulo was the inevitable outcome of a silent failure that accompanied him for more than a month of competition. From the outside, the impact was clear and forceful. The McLaren went out of control when it hit water accumulated on the curb of Turn 3 and ended up hitting the barriers hard. But McLaren engineers knew that the accident could not be explained by the asphalt conditions alone. In reality, that car had been experiencing a critical anomaly since the Azerbaijan Grand Prix weeks before. A microfracture within the hydraulic system of the rear suspension actuator compromised the operation of the pressure valve responsible for stabilizing the rear axle of the car. This type of part, designed to react in milliseconds to changes on the track and the driver's commands, was responding with a delay imperceptible to the human eye, but lethal for the balance of the car. We are not talking about a failure that completely disables the car. It wasn't a catastrophic failure that jumps on the telemetry like an alarm. It was an intermittent, silent failure that turned a supposedly competitive car into a time trap. The late reaction of the suspension meant that every corner, every braking, every support in high-load areas generated erratic behavior. The car oscillated between stability and chaos in split seconds. For Piastri, this was devastating. The driver needed confidence, immediate response, consistency in the car's behavior lap after lap. But what I got was a car that acted like it was sabotaging itself. McLaren's technical team had access to the data for weeks. Fluctuations in hydraulic pressure during heavy braking had already been recorded in Austin and Mexico. On circuits with low grip, such as those at high altitude or tight curves, the variations were evident. But no definitive intervention was ever carried out. The component was not completely disassembled, an immediate replacement of the assembly was not ordered. The team, possibly fearing upsetting the balance between its two drivers or creating a public crisis, chose to hide the problem under superficial analyses and software adjustments that did not solve the underlying problem. At Interlagos, this accumulation of omissions exploded. The water kicked up by Norris when he crossed the curb was indeed a decisive factor, but it was just the final trigger. The structural instability of the car was what turned that minor mistake into an inevitable accident. Piastri did not have the tools to correct the loss of traction in time, and when he tried to react, the car was no longer under his control. The Interlagos accident was the climax of a narrative of negligence, of systematic failures within a team that was crowned champion the previous year. A champion car turned into a technical trap, a pilot left adrift, and a secret that Andrea Stella could no longer contain. This pattern of denial culminated in Brazil, but it was in the previous weeks where the real scandal was brewing. Because every time McLaren decided not to review the hydraulic system with the seriousness it deserved, it not only put Piastri's performance at risk, it put the sporting integrity of the championship at stake. Saturday of the 2025 Brazilian Grand Prix will be remembered as one of those days in which everything aligns to end in sporting tragedy. The Interlagos sprint didn't just ruin Oscar Piastri's weekend. It was the culmination of a cycle of silent wear and tear, of an internal conflict that had been brewing inside the McLaren garage. And the most serious thing, it was the moment when the team's technical, psychological, and strategic cracks manifested themselves in a brutal way before the eyes of the world. Piastri was in third position, behind Kimi Antonelli and his teammate Lando Norris. The Australian was pressing, looking for an opportunity, showing competitive pace. But the danger did not come from the fight on the track, but from a lethal combination of external and internal factors. Norris, leading, went around the inside curb of the turn with an aggressive trajectory, kicking up a significant amount of accumulated water. That water remained suspended in the air for seconds, only to fall again right into the path of the cars behind. Antonelli perceived it. He radioed that Norris's passing had splashed his visor, a clear warning of the level of risk. The young Mercedes driver reacted instinctively. He modified his line, avoided the curbs. But Piastri did not have the same reading. In full acceleration, he stepped on that curb right at the point where the water had been redistributed. And that was where it all ended. The McLaren reacted with violence. Traction was lost immediately. The car did not destabilize little by little, there was no room for correction. It was a sharp, abrupt, uncontrollable turn. Under ideal conditions, the pilot could still have corrected. But let's remember the technical context. The hydraulic failure in the rear suspension was still there. The car offered no response. The delay in the reaction of the rear axle prevented any attempt to save the situation. Piastri was a passenger in his own misfortune. The impact was brutal, but symbolically even more devastating. McLaren had kept a driver on the track with a defective car, and that car had just crashed in conditions that others knew how to handle. It didn't take long for other drivers, such as Hülkenberg and Colapinto, to suffer similar incidents at the same point. But none of them had been fighting for weeks against a suspension that did not respond as it should. Inside the McLaren garage, the atmosphere became tense. It was known that Piastri's car was not on equal terms. Some team members commented quietly, others preferred to remain silent. Andrea Stella had to face the press minutes later. His words were measured, almost surgical. He spoke of an unfortunate situation in changing conditions, but did not once mention the technical problem with the MCL39. Interlagos Saturday was not just a day of rain and accidents. It was a painful X-ray of how accumulated errors, omitted decisions, and the pressure to perform can converge at the worst moment. And for Oscar Piastri, it was the most painful fall of his career. After Saturday's nightmare, Oscar Piastri had one chance at redemption: Sunday. Classified in 4th position on the grid, the Australian driver was in an ideal position to seek a podium to balance the chaos of the sprint. His pace in qualifying had been consistent, just 247 thousandths behind Lando Norris, a small margin considering the history of instability he had been experiencing with his car. And yet, the atmosphere within McLaren was far from optimistic. There was tension not only because of the pressure of the result, but because of the technical uncertainty that had not yet been resolved. The start of the race was clean, although marked by a constant threat: the possibility of intermittent rain. This added a layer of unpredictability to the behavior of the tires and the operating temperature of the car's systems. On lap 6, after a brief period under a safety car, the order was given to restart. It was at that moment when everything changed. Oscar Piastri, determined to make up ground and pressured by the public criticism that followed the sprint accident, made a bold decision. He launched himself on the inside of turn 1 to try to overtake Kimi Antonelli, while on the outside, Charles Leclerc performed his own maneuver on the Mercedes driver. 3 cars, 3 different routes, a common breaking point. The tension was palpable. The margins of error were minimal. Piastri braked late, slightly outside the optimal trajectory. It briefly blocked his left front tire. It was an instant. The impact was inevitable. His MCL39 touched the rear axle of Antonelli's Mercedes W16, throwing it sideways into Leclerc's SF25. The Ferrari took the worst part: a burst tire, a fractured suspension, and the race ended in just half a dozen laps. A sporting tragedy for the Scuderia, which had already suffered in the sprint. A painful double abandonment, the product of an action that, on the surface, seemed exclusively Piastri's fault. The penalty was not long in coming. 10 seconds added to your race time and 2 points on your pilot's license. A severe sanction, but consistent with the regulations. However, what affected the driver the most was not the punishment, but the silence inside the garage. There was no public defense of the team. There was no technical clarification. There was no open endorsement. Piastri carried the weight of the accident alone, while the rest of the team focused their attention on the podium of Lando Norris, who had managed to rescue a second place that kept McLaren as leader of the Constructors' Championship. The contrast was devastating. On the one hand, a driver fighting against a defective car, taking the blame for an accident caused by previous technical failures. On the other, a teammate who was capitalizing on a car in optimal condition, celebrating with the team a result that, strategically, it was in their best interest to keep in the dominant narrative. For many, it was confirmation that Piastri was not receiving the same level of internal support. This is how his weekend in Brazil ended. With fewer points than I wanted, no support, no answers. And with a reputation that was beginning to be questioned by errors that, deep down, were not entirely his. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.